Եվրոպական ու ամենից արտոնմատիչները թող չգան ուշացումով կներեք երկուսանցկեսա նշանակված տեղում չի գծվում
Your leave, you can start.
Okay, great. It's really a pleasure to be with the group today. Diverse group of junior generation of researchers who are coming from the Black Sea region. The region which basically underwent a certain type of transition which was called by my German colleague Klaus Hofe the triple transition. That's something which took place within the paradigm of the third wave of democratization, as it was noted years ago by American scholar Samuel Huntington. So basically the issue we are going to discuss today is at what extent we got success on our process of democratization in the region, and what are basically the areas where those states were successful, and which are the areas which present challenges to us and can be improved, and how they can be improved. So we're basically starting the tale of democratization within the larger context of the third wave of democracy, which started in the middle of 70s with the events which took place in Portugal and in Spain and Greece. Just recently we've been celebrating the International Students' Day, and we know that that was one of the days when events took place in Greece which later triggered basically the process of transition to democracy on the peninsula. When we are going to discuss, or if we are going to discuss the issue of democratization, obviously there are different approaches to the issue and to the content of democracy and the content of democratization. We can really underline some sort of minimalist approach when we are speaking about some minimum requirements of democracy, but we might get into the trouble if we speak about democracy and democratization only through the terms of electoral process and electoralism. So basically we are going to start with the issue of the stages of democratization, and then we'll go to transfer to the areas of democratic consolidation. So basically, what are contemporary minimum requirements when the state, the nation, could be called democracy, and we're going to see what is the level of those stages or those arenas of democracy in our countries. When we're speaking about democratization, we usually are outlining such phases like liberalization, democratization, and consolidation of democracy. For liberalization, we are usually referring to the stage when there is a certain level of tolerance which is developed in the society. This level of tolerance basically provides us with the culture of understanding, and with the culture of respecting others and respecting others' opinion. It's not necessarily that during the liberalization stage you get the complete set of liberties and freedoms which can describe democratic society, and usually democratization stage is taking place still within the previous or ancient regime, the regime which is still non-democratized, it's not democracy, but certain steps are taken within the elites of previous regimes, or there are certain steps which are taken by the society itself, which provides us with the possibility to speak about minimum level of liberalization. If we take post-Soviet context, or if we will take the states from former Soviet Union, liberalization actually took place in the form of perestroika, in the form of certain redesign of political system. So basically the idea was to introduce some novelty into regime but not to change the regime per se. So it was some sort of idea to develop socialism with human face, as it was said in the late 60s during the reformation process in Czechoslovakia during Alexander Dubček's period, which could also be considered as some sort of try of liberalization for the regime. The logic of liberalization, which was introduced during the Soviet rule, introduced basically certain level or certain areas for tolerance of others, and that basically included introduction of certain elements into the civic culture and civil society. Certain uncertain changes within the economic system, but basically the main body, the main structure wasn't touched. But what took place later, it was the process of disintegration of Soviet Union and the process of political reformation of the system, which actually adds to political and economic reforms in the area. So in some stages, in particular in former Soviet Union space, we're speaking about this triple transition, which includes political part, economic part, and the nation building or state building process. My Ukrainian colleague Taras Kuzio also was speaking about not the triple but quadruple transition, when he was dividing not only political and economic reforms, but also reforms in the or changes in the area of nation building and state building, which is still going to take place in some part of the region. So within the liberalization process in the area of former Soviet Union, we're basically speaking about introduction of certain level of tolerance and introduction of certain degree of liberties which allowed basically the civil society to start develop. And that civil society was basically in place partly in some parts of this former post-socialist or socialist space, like in Poland. The Solidarność movement, the independent trade union Solidarność, was basically the outbreak or the way the civil society was acting for quite a period of time, especially if we will consider the approach which was adopted by them when they were speaking that we are going to act as we are free. The next stage for democratization process is usually called democratization. So basically, the next stage corresponds or is the same as the entire process. The main feature for democratization is conduction of free and fair elections or conduction of so-called founding elections. And the results of those founding elections are basically quite important for future process of democratization. Because usually when you get into the newly elected legislature, political forces which are supportive to democracy, you are able to start the process and conduct this process with certain level of certainty and certain level of possible and predictable outcomes. In case you get non-democratic forces in the parliament during the founding elections, you are basically, the system is not basically secure for democratic transition, and you might end with formation or development of new non-democratic regime which could be built on previous experience. Finally, the third stage for this transition is usually referred to as consolidation of democracy. And consolidation as a term probably requires certain operationalization. In this case, we are speaking mostly about three main areas when democracy is considered as so-called only game in the city or in town. And those levels include a behavior level of attitudes, and constitutional or institutional level. What do we mean by each of them? By behavior level, we basically understand that within the society there are no any significant groups which are trying or spending resources, significant resources, aimed at breakdown of the democratic regime. So basically, when we are speaking about consolidation, we mean that regime could not be, the democracy could not be experience a breakdown, with possible exception of certain force majeure situation. So at the level of behavior, we are speaking about certain groups of population or lack of certain groups of population which are trying to overturn the existing regime. For the attitudes, we are speaking about the attitudes on both sides of elites, which are keeping certain democratic rhetoric and certain democratic actions, but we are also speaking about the values within the society. Basically, you need at least 75% of the population who are supporting democracy as a regime if you want to have consolidation at the attitudes level, and you must have as the same level of no support to non-democratic alternatives. So basically at the level of attitudes, you are speaking about a recognition of democracy and elections as a value, but at the same time you are negatively presenting your approach to any non-democratic alternative. What can come up as an alternative is basically concentration of power within the hands of one person, and quite often that might be somebody from the executive. Concentration of power within some oligarchic elites or oligarchic groups, which is not considered as democracy as well, obviously. And we are speaking about the attitudes when population is basically disagrees with such kind of approach, when, for example, it could be suggested that legislature will be losing its power or will not be using its power for a certain period of time when the country is in crisis. Finally, when we're speaking about the level of constitutional norms, we're basically agreeing with the fact that majority or main part of political actors basically agrees that they have to complete the game of democracy within the existing frames, and those frames for democracy have been adopted through democratic process. So those are the minimalist stages which majority of our states has undergone during the recent period of transitions. If we are speaking about the liberalization, we can speak about former Soviet republics which underwent general liberalization within the frames of Soviet Union, and they went to the stage of democratization, having its own elections. That was true for Georgia when the first president, Zviagdam Sahurdia, was elected as the president of Georgia. It's another issue. What happened next at this moment, we are not going to discuss it, but the same was true for Armenia when in early 1990, in May of 1990, we had parliamentary elections, semi-free, but basically we were able to elect the parliament when there was no dominance of previously existing elites. What we had basically, it was a semi-free parliament with different political forces which were introduced or which were present in the parliament. Basically that included on one hand the previously existing elites, but in addition to that, thanks to previously developed civil movement, you had also we had also a possibility to have it transformed into wider political movement with its representation in the parliament after the May 1990 elections, which followed with presidential elections in 1991, which generally are considered as free and fair. And afterwards we can speak about the institutional process of institutional design or redesign or institutional crafting, which was taking place through the entire 1990s. The same will be basically true for countries like Ukraine and Bulgaria, where competitive elections took place in early 1990s, and existence of those competitive elections actually allows us to say that majority of those countries underwent the stage of democratization at quite early stage of political transition. Finally, when we are getting back to the areas where democracy must be considered as consolidated, and those areas must be present in different states. We're meeting with 5 different areas which could be presented as following. You need to establish the civil society, political society, the rule of law, develop effective state apparatus, bureaucracy, and finally you have to establish economic society. So we're going to go through all those 5 areas to understand where we are at this stage of transition in different states which are represented in our project and in more broad post-Soviet or post-socialist context. The first area which was outlined is civil society. So we have to at least define in minimal terms what do we understand as a civil society and what are the main actions and main actors within the civil society. And the next question will be how developed is the civil society in our part of the world. In general terms, the civil society will mean that there is a freedom of association and freedom of communication between or within the society. When citizens, and they consider themselves as citizens, are able to form structures which are acting independently from the state, and those structures or units are based on certain shared ideas or certain shared values, and based on those shared values and ideas, citizens groups are forming certain type of organizations. Do we have civil society, and what are basically challenges for the civil society? One of the main challenges for the current period might be the issue of cooperation or miscooperation between the state and society. Sometimes they are not considered as actors which can help each other, but they unfortunately are considered by each other as enemies which are trying to come up as a part of competitive politics. That's not true, basically, because civil society ideally is not acting as part of competitive political society, but it's acting as an independent player which has the function of control over political powers or power holders. But the history of relations between the civil society and the state is quite different in our part of the world for different states. In some cases, the civil society was the force which basically introduced or was used to introduce changes within political system. So we can refer to some sort of color revolution when civil society, which was joined by political actors or alternative elites, was basically the major player for political changes. Probably the history of orange revolutions in Ukraine is one part of the story. The same might be true for countries like Georgia when Rose Revolution basically took place under the certain guidance of political leaders, but with the massive and extensive inclusion of civil society into the process. For Armenian case, when we are studying the history of civil society development, especially through the phase of liberalization, we definitely have to start with ecological movements, with the movement which was aimed to better or introduce betterments into the quality of life, basically. And further on, it was transformed into more political movement, which put forward the idea of introducing of independence, in particularly in Armenia. And that was the main mover of the process in late 90s or late 80s, early 1990s. I'm not quite sure if the same was the role of the civil society in countries like Bulgaria, but basically when we are speaking about the process of liberalization, process of democratization, you need at least more than one player to introduce at further stage, at the stage of democratization, certain competition between different powers. And by default, in post-totalitarian regimes, you don't have any alternative to political elites besides forming civil society or proto-civil society. That's why you get the leaders within new regime who are coming from the civil society, and those are the leaders which can introduce new values or can negotiate basically the transition, because the stages and the types of transition could be really different. From one hand, you can have the transition which comes from above, when elites are basically dictating the cases or dictating the way transition will take place. But it's not always the case when all those reforms and transitions are taking place just from above. Also, that was the case in most of former Soviet republics. You can have the case when you get into the process of negotiation between different types of elites, as it was in Spain, for example, in mid-70s, or in Poland later. You can get almost the same story for the involvement of civil society elements into a negotiation process in countries like Czechoslovakia later and Hungary, where again there was some sort of political process which involved representatives of alternative elites. But basically the issue was how the civil society will be transformed into political player, keeping links between the society and the interests which are articulated by the society. As in most cases, you will get into the trouble of iron rule of oligarchy, as it was described by Robert Michels. So the civil society is a developed civil society, and existence of freedom for establishing the units of structures of civil society is one of the major prerequisites for developing of sustainable and long-lasting democracy. In our part of the world, we can speak about different level of development of civil society, but what is the fact, what nobody can challenge basically is the issue of existence of not always vibrant, but at least forming civil society with its structures, with its peculiarities, with its already tradition of involvement or non-involvement into political process, but basically the civil society is alive, and the good news is basically that we have whatever is called civil society. All problems which exist with that are usually associated with its relations with other parts like state or economic society. The second area, which could be called political society, basically means existence of free and inclusive contestation, political contestation. And here we get different pictures which could be assessed by various indicators, but we can refer basically to international monitoring missions which are present during different electoral campaigns almost in every country. There are almost no exceptions, with maybe some cases where international observers are not allowed to participate in the electoral process. But when we are assessing the system which is formed based on the elections, we are getting into maybe two and a half types of the regimes which are considered as partly free, or in some cases not free. We're not speaking in this case about not free elections which bring us to the development of not free regime, but when we're speaking about partly free and free developed also based on the electoral process, we can see the differences which exist in the electoral process as well. The electoral process, which might be assessed as free and fair, will require the explanation what do we mean by free and fair elections. It's considered that the phrase free and fair elections was first used in late 50s when elections in Togo by observers, and later on this phrase, the free and fair elections, was also used for the assessment of the elections in other parts of the world. What do we mean by free and fair elections, and what are the stages when we are going to assess them? First, we are outlining three major areas or three major steps of the electoral process, which is something which takes place before the elections, during the day of the elections, and after the elections. In very general terms, the freedom will mean lack of use of force and possibility of alternatives to exist. When we're speaking about fairness, we're basically referring to two elements. The first element is use of the law in the same way towards all political actors, and we are speaking about relatively equal distribution of the resources. And if you don't have the freedom during the elections, we cannot basically speak about the fairness of this electoral process. Based on this electoral process, you're getting officials which, according to the existing constitution de jure, but also in political practice de facto, must be able to implement the functions which are assigned to them, and there must be no so-called gray or reserved zones where political actors are not able to implement their activities and use their functions or their resources. From political point of democratization, political society existence basically means the way when there are parties which are losing during the election. So we can describe democracy in this case in the terms like there is a system when parties are losing during the election. So it basically means there's political contestation between different policies, between different parties, and between different social and social political interests which exist in the society. From this point of view, when we are assessing political system, we can see that during the transition, not all of the states in our part of the world are still considered as free, and we still are and we still have quite a bunch of countries which are in those so-called gray zone with partly free regime. So the main issue here which might be outlined is development of precondition for further development of competitive politics and making political actors responsible to the citizens. How it can take place, basically, it also definitely includes includes civil society, which must implement its function of control towards the power holders. The third area is the area of the rule of law, which could be described in terms of constitutionalism, when you have the constitution which is accepted by a majority of players and which could not be changed without supermajorities. Again, we can refer to different practices of the constitutional amendments, but almost in all countries in our part of the world, we can see that constitutions are amended quite oftenly. In Armenian case, we had the constitution which was adopted in 1995, but then there was ongoing constitutional amendment process first through 2003, a referendum which get majority of votes, but this majority wasn't enough to introduce the amendments, and later on in 2005, even now the issue of political changes and changes of the constitution are on the political agenda in Armenia as the new commission was formed to introduce the main areas for constitutional changes. If we'll go to the Georgian experience, we can see again that the constitution was periodically adopted, readopted, or edited under different rulers. And unfortunately, the impression one will get is that constitution is not the basic act which is used for political game, but constitution is periodically adopted or amended through or thanks to certain vision of political leaders. There was no surprise, for example, when Georgian constitution was amended during Saakashvili time, and everybody was assuming that basically the constitution was adopted or amended because president will not be able to be re-elected anymore, and he is trying to establish sort of political base for his future presence in the system. Also, there was an opposite view when it was said that basically there was a requirement from the opposition side to introduce more characteristics of parliamentary regime within the system, so the concentration of power within the hands of presidents will be reduced. Obviously, you have the facts and you have different analysis for these facts, and both approaches might have their place regarding the Georgian experience. Later, when we can move to Ukrainian experience, we will basically experience the same constant amendments process within the constitution after the Orange Revolution, when the system was readopted and the law on constitutional changes basically was took place. And later on, you can see that during Yanukovych time, the amendments which took place in the or late stage of Fourth Orange Revolution were considered as non-legitimate or illegal, basically. And after the recent events in Ukraine, again we can see that constitution was repeatedly amended or actually changed, returned to the previous text of the constitution, basically considering the power structure and structure of political elites and interrelations between different branches of government, and quite often between different personalities. In Armenian case, when we are speaking about constitutional amendments, basically there were three major areas for constitutional redesign. The first area was the area of rights, when there was a need to introduce in more clarified or purified forms the need for introduction of liberties and freedoms for the citizens. The second area for the reforms in Armenian case was the interrelations between the macro level of political institutions, meaning president, parliament, head of the executive, and the functions of constitutional court. And the system was adopted basically considering the fact that concentration of powers within the hands of president will not allow to develop more sustainable regime, more sustainable democracy in these terms. And what is the issue of discussion in politics now is the interrelations of the type of government, saying that presidential, semi-presidential, or parliamentary, with the type of the regime, and how successful regimes can be, I mean democracy can be, having different types of forms of government, saying parliamentary, semi-presidential, and presidential again. General conventional wisdom, which was introduced in mid-90s, said that parliamentary regimes are basically providing more elements for the development of democracy, while regimes with power concentration within the president, saying that presidential regimes are less supportive to democratic development. But the truth is probably not to use only the type of government, but also to discuss and analyze different other structures within the system, like electoral system, party system, and type of the interrelations between the executive and legislature, because they're all interrelated, and within the system you basically have to tune it in a way which will allow quite effective development. So the first area for the rule of law is having living constitution, which is considered as the main basic law with which political actors are agreed. And as we can see in our part of the world, this constitutional amendments is quite a constant process, and it's really hard to speak about the constant presence of constitutionalists from this point of view. But there's even more. In some cases, you can have laws which are contradicting to the existing constitution. I'm referring in particular, for example, to Russian experience in late 1999, basically early 2000. According to different calculations, approximately one-third of the regional of non-federal laws which were adopted by the subjects of the Russian Federation were in contradiction with the constitution of the country. So you can see that there is not only the process of amendment of constitution, but there is a need to introduce changes or amendments within the legislature aimed to bring it into correspondence with the minimum requirements of constitutionalism. Another part which is quite important for constitutionalism is the existence of legal culture within the population, within the general body of citizens. And basically the issue is to develop the body of citizens which are considering the system in terms of legitimacy from the viewpoint of rational legitimacy, when the basis for agreeing with the power and power institution is the belief of the citizens that it must act based on the laws. So we have issues with the rule of law here, but what we can say is that the situation again is improving, and again, Georgian case during Saakashvili time could be brought forward here as a case when the rule of law was introduced in the country and the legal culture was submitted or changed, in particular was changed. The next area is the state apparatus, which basically means that there is a need in democracy to have professional civil servants, which are not actually dependent on political process, which are selected based on the merits, and there is quite a developed system of norms which can be introduced and which are known to all participants of this game when career developments are taking place within those norms based on the merits of the bureaucrat. The system which we got from previous regime was not always based on such kind of merits, so the idea was to develop an independent civil service which will form the rules for the game for future development of bureaucracy. And again, experience in our part of the world shows that the basis or basics for such kind of rules being developed, and especially at the low and mid-level of bureaucratic career, the merit-based principle is used quite often, and basically it's a mainstream for bureaucratic development. Finally, the economic society, which could be considered as existence of the state within running market economy. We cannot say that economic society is basically the same as a market economy, because market, besides market, you have the state regulation within different spheres of the society, and not all property basically is owned privately, and there is a state property which must be managed as well. In addition to that, the state is also accomplishing different other functions like regulation and management or administration of the state property, and management and regulations of the norms which will disallow the existence and development of monopolies, or state is responsible basically for implementation of financial policy within the national level. So there's a certain understanding that market economy must be in place, but on the top of that you have certain regulatory functions which are accomplished by the state. So when we are speaking about those 5 areas which were mentioned, we can see that different states in our part of the world are existing or developing at different stages of these arenas of democracy, and not all of them, or almost none of them, are at the level when democracy might be consolidated from this point of view, because there are certain troubles with different areas. In civil society is certain antagonism between the civil society and the state structures. Both are trying to consider each other as antagonists, but rather than a friend or cooperator. In from other point of view, civil society is not always developed also for financial reasons, for the reason of resources. The civil society structures quite often are trying or dependent on foreign donors rather than on resources which must be generated basically by the economic society. So here are the issues, at least some major issues with the civil society. For political society, while you have formally the competitive electoral process with participation of different actors within elections and afterwards, you still don't have completely free and fair electoral system and electoral process. You still don't have perfectly introduced horizontal accountability for the powers and power holders, and you basically might have problems with representation of different or diverse interests within the macro political institutions. But formally, the rules of the game are there. For the rule of law issue, it's not only the issue of dominance or the issue of prevailing of the norms of the law within the system, but also the issues related to uncertainty with the constitutionalism per se, uncertainties with the constitutional norms per se. Although it was mentioned sometime that average life of constitution is about 12-15 years. So it's less than the period of one generation, so each generation can experience the changes within the constitution, as constitution is a living body which must be changed or might be changed during the lifetime of a person. Within state apparatus, despite there is an issue of merit-based development of bureaucracy, you still have corruption, which is quite often associated with the state structures. So states are trying to minimize direct involvement of bureaucrats in their relations with citizens, trying to introduce different measures to lessen the level of corruptions or the risks for such kind of corruption. But state bureaucracy is definitely in place, it's definitely trained, is definitely using at least partly norms for the merit-based competition and merit-based achievements or continuation of their career, but again, it's not perfect at all. Finally, with economic society, you still don't have a developed market and you have situations sometimes when there are certain monopolies which are explained by simple fact of the size of the state, but I don't think that in some cases this explanation which is presented is really reasonable. For example, Estonia, which is kind of small state, and it's another discussion what we do consider as a small state, is the state with a quite running market economy with definitely no big monopolies in different parts of the economic society. If we are trying to underline or present certain conclusions regarding the major areas for democratization, we can state that different states are currently at different levels of consolidation or are in the situation which could be described as a gray zone or hybrid regime, the term which was coined in the late 90s when it was clear that regimes which are coming out after the transition, they are not so-called pure types of regimes, but they're somewhere in between. And the major issue for majority of countries for now, it's coming out from this gray zone and trying to accomplish democratic consolidation or establish a regime where everything might be or might seem more clear than it is at this moment. But now we can state that we are at the stage of certain equilibrium when you already have established regimes which are trying to reintroduce themselves on one stage, on one case, and on the other hand, you have more revolutionary, more passionate type of regimes, like that was the case in Ukraine. I don't want to go into the reasons how and why and when it happens, but basically you can see that there are also regimes which are not stable also not from the viewpoint of the content of the regime, but from the content and viewpoint of political stability in general. The final note will be that existence of sustainable democracy will also develop the existence of sustainable and stable regime, and democratic stability is one of the elements which will or must be established in case those 5 areas or areas of democratic consolidation will be in place. I'm now ready to leave the floor for questions, and I'll be really glad to take your questions through audio files or via just typing your question, and I'll be glad to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was great hearing you for the lecture. We have availability to ask the question from Odessa or from Izmir, Turkey. Izmir, if you are ready, because your sound is switched off now, just show the face when it switches on. And we will probably start with the first question from here, from Odessa. As we are talking about the Black Sea region and the countries and the transition of democracy, how would you correlate the national interest, national security, and democratic rights in countries like Russia, Armenia, Georgia now, or Ukraine? What should prevail, national security or democratic rights?
Okay, basically they are interrelated because you know there's approach when you have democratic regime, and based on the democratic regime, basically all citizens are secure within the system, and all neighbors are basically secure in case you have a democratic regime, as there is a tendency that democracy don't go to war to each other. In some cases, the issue of national security might be prevailing, but that brings us to the issue of the reason or the threats or challenges to national security. Quite often, as a threat to national security is the issue of state building and nation building. And when we are speaking about democratization process, unfortunately, there is a strict, I would say, there is a strict rule that countries which are undergoing through the issues of the stateness, which have secessionist movements, they're having troubles also with democratic consolidation and democratization of the regime. So unfortunately, the reasons of raison d'etre of the state provide it with the good reasoning in case of security issues to minimize the regime from the viewpoint of democracy and increase certain more assets. And that can be seen also, and definitely can be seen in hybridization of different regimes. So if we'll speak about security and national security and democracy, first it's definite that in case you have already established democracy, you are working at the national security. On the other hand, when you are speaking about the national security as one of the elements or prerequisites for it, its development of vibrant political and civil society and internal or domestic security could not be seen without development of civil and political society per se. But when we are going back to a real politic or real political approaches, you can see that elites might prefer to have security issues to dominate over the issues of regime, and they prefer to keep the security issues which could be considered as more or higher political priorities for the system. It's not new, basically, for the story of democratization to have security issues be prevailing over the issue of regimes. If you take African countries or Asian countries in 50s and 60s, there was a discussion what you have to have first, you have to do a political transition and democratize the regime, or you have to have secured regime with certain minimum level of economic development, and later based on economic success and legitimacy which is provided to regimes through economic efficiency, you are able to introduce political democracy and introduce, in general, democracy as a regime. The story is quite old, and there is still no general agreement within transitional studies what has to take place, political or economic reforms, or you have to do them simultaneously. But you can see the stories which ended quite successfully in so-called Eastern or New Europe, when political and economic reforms basically took place simultaneously, and countries were able to develop democracy as a regime, and they were not treated by other states, or the issues which were existing between the state, Romania and Hungary, for example, might be a case. They were able to solve that based on the negotiation process. Unfortunately, not all conflicts which exist in our part of the world are solved based on the negotiations, and we periodically have the outbreaks of war or outbreaks of conflict between different states. And here again you can see that issue of national security is kind of prevailing over democracy, while it's also understood by political elites that under democracy there are no great internal threats to security, while still you are living in certain political environment in a certain region of the world where there are not only democratic regimes which are able to provide security to you as a neighbor. So based on this real political approach, you can state that national security issues are oftenly prevailing over democracy, and you can bring here the issue which followed actually the 9/11 events and all the stuff associated with certain, for example, Guantanamo cases, when you can see that in real politics the national security issues are prevailing over democracy. But what is important, that there is an existing democratic control in those cases over the issues of national security. But what is reality, it's quite often does not correspond to what we are saying or what we are having in theoretical works.
Thank you very much. Izmir, do you have a question?
As bad professors are asking in this case, everything was so clear or everything was so unclear that there are no questions?
No, we just need time for adjusting to coming for the camera. Okay, we have yet one question from here. A lot was said that the Arab revolutions, as a process of democratization, can have a huge influence to the three Caucasus states as well. And some experts made parallels that color revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia, it was the first step. The second step is Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring. And in the future, we can expect the third wave of the events in Caucasus states, something like the influence from this process. Do you believe in such options, and do you believe that these waves are connected between each other?
Well, if we'll start with some sort of conspiratology, you can definitely link the events which took place in Serbia, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, with the events which later took place in Maghreb countries. But on the other hand, you can see that there is definitely certain regionalism when you can differ the issue which or developments which took place in Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, somehow maybe in Kyrgyzstan, and there were tries in Armenia, and distinguish them from events which took place in Arab countries or Arab-speaking countries. In Georgia and Ukraine, what happened basically, its existence of secular culture compared to more elements of religion and influence of Muslim Brotherhood, in particularly in Egypt. So you can see that in Georgian and Ukrainian case, were successful cases of color revolutions, you got political elites changes within the power, which actually allowed future political process. And Georgian and again Ukrainian, not so much Ukrainian, but Georgian case actually allowed further the change of guards during the recent elections. I mean, recent Georgian parliamentary, relatively recent Georgian parliamentary elections. So from this point of view, I don't expect any further developments in Georgia in a way of revolution, because it seems that the events which are taking place there and citizens are actually habitualized with the culture of elections, and actually they're quite sure that elections is the way to possibly change the guards. For Arab countries, what took place in some cases, like Libya, is basically the disintegration of the state, which you can actually see now. In Egyptian case, they went basically from establishing also electoral but non-democratic regimes. Its future transition to a normal military junta or military power concentration. And if we are speaking about Caucasian countries, there is no actually tradition of such kind of power concentration in hands of military. For Egypt, it was more or less normal after the 50s, when first you get this generation of mid-officer, Gamal Abdel Nasser and Anwar Sadat, who were actually military officers, and later on Mubarak, Hosni Mubarak, who was army officer as well. So there are definitely certain differences between our part of the world and events which took place in Northern Africa. If we are trying to speak about extrapolation or possible new wave of events in South Caucasus, we already excluded Georgia. In Armenia and Azerbaijan, it seems that the regime is quite consolidated and is able to use its resources, at least at level we can see at this moment, to remain in power. Also, there were recent information regarding dissemination of Islamic State powers or Islamic State agents in Azerbaijan, but it's not quite clear at the moment how strong the Islamic fundamentalists or Islamic revolutionaries, how with weapon in their hands, will be able to influence politics in Azerbaijan. In Armenian case, we had the experience of 2008 presidential elections, when after the elections for 10 days there were mass, you can compare that basically with Maidan events in Kiev, but they ended within 10 days. Also, there were approximately 10 people killed, including police officers and citizens, and more than 100 were wounded. But that was some kind of short, like прививка, which society get. And here again, coming back to the issue of the national security, this existence of external conflict might actually provide another level of consolidation within the society, considering the fact of the existing external threat in the region, which might actually stop the real revolutionary developments. And actually, Armenian politics was almost never revolutionary, and you see that majority of political actors as well as the citizens will prefer evolutionary way of development rather than revolution. So in short, or the short answer will be within conspiratology, within the case when you are including any external actors who are influencing your local or domestic politics, you definitely can explain or analyze situation and say, okay, never say never. But if you are going through more rational analysis and you're trying to analyze the real balance or imbalance between different powers or different groups of different political groups, you don't see the rationale behind the possible existence of Arab scenario in South Caucasus.
Thank you very much, Rector. It was great having you today with us at Online Taxi University. We really highly appreciate your efforts, your time, and the lecture. It will be published at YouTube, so our other partners' university will be able to see it as well, and also the public interested in Black Sea affairs. And dear friends, we are waiting you on the 11th of December, again online, and we will speak about European Union and the Black Sea region. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much. The pleasure was all mine, and I look forward to meet the audience later during the year. Thank you very much again, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.